My grandson broke my BP monitor, my son laughed. They both regretted it by sunset. I am 76 years old, and I have buried a husband, raised 2 children mostly alone, and survived a knee replacement without so much as a whimper. But nothing prepared me for the moment I watched my own son stand in my kitchen and laugh while I held the shattered pieces of the one thing keeping me alive in my 2 hands. Before I tell you what happened next and what I quietly did about it by sunset that very same day, hit that like button, type subscribe if you believe grandmothers deserve respect too, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. I read every single one of them. Now let me take you back to the morning it all started. My name is Amanda. I live alone in a small blue house at the edge of town. The same house my late husband Edwin and I bought 48 years ago with money we didn't really have. He's been gone 11 years now. The house creaks in places it never used to, and some mornings my knees complain louder than the floorboards. But I've kept it going. I've kept myself going. That's what you do when you're a widow with pride and not much else. My heart isn't what it used to be. 3 years ago I had a scare. The kind where you wake up in a hospital bed with tubes in your arm and a doctor telling you words like arrhythmia and monitor your pressure daily, Mrs. Amanda, without fail. My daughter, bless her, bought me a proper digital blood pressure monitor after that. Not the cheap kind from the pharmacy clearance bin, a good one with a memory function so I could track my numbers and show them to my cardiologist every few months. That machine wasn't just plastic and wires to me. It was the thing standing between me quietly living out my years in my own home, or being shipped off to some facility because nobody trusted me to manage on my own anymore. My son lives 20 minutes away with his wife and their boy, my grandson, who is 11 years old and, I'll be honest with you, has never once in his life been told no and meant it. I love that child. I do. But loving a child and excusing everything he does are 2 very different things, and my son has never understood the difference. That Saturday started like any other. My son dropped the boy off at my house for the afternoon because he and his wife had errands, which I've learned over the years is code for wanting a few hours of peace without a child underfoot. I don't mind. I like having my grandson around. I make him grilled cheese, we watch old game shows, and sometimes he helps me water the tomatoes out back. It's one of the few things that makes this quiet house feel less quiet. That day, though, he came in already restless, already bouncing off the walls the way children do when nobody set a single boundary for them all week. He was running through my living room with a toy airplane, arms out, engine noises blaring from his mouth, weaving between my furniture like my home was an obstacle course built for his entertainment. I was sitting in my recliner, and on the little side table beside me sat my blood pressure monitor. I just finished taking my afternoon reading the way I do every day at the same time, like clockwork, the way my cardiologist insists on. I hadn't put it away yet. I was writing the numbers down in my little notebook when I heard it, the airplane in his hand, the wide arcing swing of his arm, and then the crash. The monitor hit the hardwood floor and split clean in 2. The little screen cracked into a spiderweb of lines. The cuff went skidding under the couch. I sat there for a moment just staring at it, my pen still hovering over my notebook, not quite believing what I was looking at. Oops, my grandson said. Just that. Oops. And then he kept running, kept making his engine noises, like he hadn't just destroyed something that mattered more than he could possibly understand. I called my son that evening once he'd come to pick the boy up. I explained calmly, because I always try to explain things calmly first, that the monitor was broken, that it wasn't cheap, that I genuinely needed it for my heart condition, and that I would appreciate some help replacing it since a child's carelessness was the reason it was gone. And my son, my own son, 44 years old, a grown man with a mortgage and a job and a child of his own, he laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an apologetic laugh. A real dismissive laugh, the kind you give when you think something is genuinely funny and not worth taking seriously. Mom, it's a blood pressure cuff, not the moon landing, he said. He's a kid. Kids break things. Just go buy another one, it's like $30 at the pharmacy. I told him it wasn't $30, that it was the good one his sister bought me, closer to $90, with a memory function my doctor specifically wanted me using. I told him that at my age, on my fixed income, $90 isn't nothing, and that beyond the money, I genuinely needed that device working every single day. He waved it off. Actually waved his hand at me, like I was a fly buzzing around his dinner. You're being dramatic. I'll send you a link to one on sale sometime. Relax. And then he loaded his son into the car, still laughing a little to himself, and drove off without so much as looking back at me standing in my own doorway. I want you to understand something about me before I go any further. I am not a woman who screams. I am not a woman who slams doors or cries where people can see me. I was raised by a mother who used to say, Amanda, when someone shows you who they are, don't argue with them, just remember it. And I have remembered plenty over 76 years. I have a very long memory, and an even longer patience. I stood in my kitchen that night with the broken pieces of my monitor on the counter in front of me, and I didn't cry, and I didn't call my daughter to complain, and I didn't sit and stew in anger the way some people might expect an old woman to do. I made a pot of tea, sat at my kitchen table, and I thought. I thought about my son's tone. I thought about the way he laughed. I thought about how lately every single time something of mine got damaged or dismissed or overlooked, it was always met with the same response. A joke, a wave of the hand, a relaxed mom. As if my needs, my health, my home, were all just minor inconveniences standing between him and whatever he'd rather be doing. And I realized something that night, sipping my tea in that quiet kitchen. My son had gotten comfortable. Comfortable assuming I would always absorb the cost. Comfortable assuming I would always let it go. Comfortable assuming that because I'm old and soft-spoken I don't notice patterns, don't keep score, don't plan. He was wrong about that. I notice everything. Here is something my son doesn't think about very often, because young people rarely do until it's put right in front of them. I still hold the deed to a small rental property 2 streets over, the one Edwin and I bought back in the 80s and fixed up ourselves. For the past 6 years I've let my son live in it essentially rent-free, charging him a token amount, $400 a month, a fraction of what it's actually worth on today's market, because he's my son and I wanted to help him get on his feet after a rough patch in his marriage. We never signed anything formal. It was a handshake arrangement between a mother and her boy. I trusted him. I never once brought it up as leverage, not in 6 years. But trust, I've learned, has to run in both directions. The next morning I called my daughter, not to complain about her brother, but simply to ask her a favor. I asked her to help me order a new blood pressure monitor online, the exact same model, express shipping, and I paid for it myself out of my own pocket without a second thought, because that machine mattered to my health and I wasn't about to let my heart wait on someone else's convenience. It arrived 2 days later. I want to be clear about that, because this story isn't about me sitting around helpless waiting for a man to fix my problem. I fixed my own problem within 48 hours. That was never really what this was about. What this was about was a lesson. A quiet one. The kind that doesn't need shouting to land. I called a property attorney I've known for years. A calm, thorough woman who handled the paperwork for Edwin's estate back when he passed. I explained the arrangement I had with my son, told her I wanted to formalize it properly going forward. A real lease at fair market value, effective the following month, the way any responsible landlord should have been doing from the start. She drew it up within the week. Nothing dramatic. Nothing cruel. Just business, conducted the way it should have been conducted years ago, if I hadn't let sentiment cloud my judgment out of love for my son. I also made one more call, this one to my accountant, who reminded me that I'd been quietly listed as a joint contact on my son's small home improvement loan, one he'd taken out 2 years back to redo the kitchen, using my good credit as a cosigner because his own credit wasn't strong enough at the time to qualify a loan. I'd forgotten how much weight that little signature actually carried until my accountant laid it out plainly for me. I wasn't going to do anything drastic with that information. I want to be honest with you about that. But knowing it was there, knowing the true shape of how much my son actually depended on me whether he admitted it or not settled something in me. It reminded me that the laughter in my kitchen that night hadn't come from a position of strength. It had come from a man who'd simply never been made to sit still and look at how much he leaned on his mother. That Sunday, I invited my son and his family over for dinner, same as I do most weekends. Nothing about my invitation hinted at anything unusual. I made pot roast the way Edwin used to love it, and I set the table the way I always do with the good napkins because I like nice things even when it's just family. My grandson came bounding in first, and do you know what that sweet boy did? He walked straight up to me before he even took his coat off, and he held out a small gift bag with tissue paper poking out the top. "Grandma, I'm sorry about your machine thing," he said, looking right at me. No prompting that I could see. I used my allowance. "I hope it's the right one." Inside was a blood pressure monitor, the wrong brand, definitely not as good as the one I'd already replaced myself, but it didn't matter one bit. That child had thought about what he'd done, had felt the weight of it on his own, and had fixed it in the only way an 11-year-old knows how, with his own money and his own 2 hands. I hugged him so tightly he squirmed. I told him he was a good, thoughtful boy, and that I forgave him completely because I meant every word of it. Children make mistakes. That was never really the issue. Then I looked at my son. I waited until dinner was nearly finished, until my grandson had excused himself to go watch cartoons in the other room, before I set the folder down on the table between us. Calm as anything. I told him I'd had the property attorney draw up a proper lease for the rental, effective next month at current market rate, same as I would offer any tenant. I told him I loved him, that this wasn't punishment, but that I was getting older, that my expenses were rising same as everyone else's, and that it was time the arrangement reflected what was fair rather than what was convenient. His face went through about 4 different expressions in the space of 10 seconds. Confusion first. Then something like calculation, like he was doing the math on what the new rent would mean for his monthly budget. Then finally something closer to shame, though he tried to cover it with a laugh that came out thin and unconvincing this time. Nothing like the laugh in my kitchen days before. Mom, this is because of the blood pressure thing, isn't it? I told him no, and I meant that too, mostly. I told him it was because I'd realized I'd been letting a lot of things slide for a long time out of love, and that love doesn't mean I stopped taking care of myself. I told him that when he laughed at me over something that genuinely mattered to my health, it wasn't really about $30 or $90 or the cuff itself. It was about him not stopping, even for a second, to consider that his mother's well-being was worth more than a joke. I told him that I'd already replaced the monitor myself, quietly, without asking him for a dime, because I've always taken care of myself and I always will. But that the rest of it, the rent, the arrangement, that was simply me finally treating myself with the same respect I'd apparently forgotten to ask of him. His wife, to her credit, reached over and squeezed his hand and told him quietly that I was right, that they'd talked about how thin they'd been stretching my generosity for a while now and both knew it. That surprised me. I hadn't expected an ally at that table, but I was grateful for her honesty. By the time the sun went down that Sunday, my son sat in my living room a much quieter man than the one who'd laughed in my kitchen days before. Not angry, not sulking, just thoughtful, the way I'd wanted him to be from the start. He apologized properly this time, no jokes, no waving hands. He said he hadn't thought about how it looked, laughing like that, and that he'd make sure his son understood breaking things has consequences beyond just an oops. He also said quietly that he was proud of me, actually proud, for handling my own life the way I did instead of just complaining and waiting for someone to rescue me. My grandson fell asleep on my couch that evening before they left, worn out from a full day of being a normal, energetic, occasionally careless 11-year-old boy, exactly as he should be. I sat beside him for a while before waking him gently to go home, and I found myself thinking that this really was never a war I wanted to win by hurting anyone. It was simply a lesson in reminding my family that respect isn't something an old woman should have to beg for at her own kitchen table. The new monitor sits on my side table now, right where the old one used to be. I take my reading every afternoon at the same time, write the numbers in my little notebook, same as always. My numbers have actually been better lately, if you can believe that. My cardiologist says stress does strange things to the body, and I suppose finally standing up for myself quietly and without shouting did more for my blood pressure than any machine ever could. My son calls me more often now. Not out of guilt, I don't think, but because something shifted in him that Sunday evening, some quiet recalibration of who I am to him beyond just mom who's always there. My grandson still comes over most Saturdays, still runs a little wild through my living room, but he gives my side table a wide berth now, and every so often he asks, completely unprompted, "How's your blood pressure today, Grandma?" I tell him it's just fine, sweetheart. Better than it's been in years, actually. If you've made it this far with me, thank you for sitting through an old woman's story. I'm not here to tell you to go tear up leases or call attorneys over every little slight. Life's too short and family's too precious for that kind of thinking. What I am here to tell you is that respect, once you stop asking for it and simply start requiring it, has a funny way of finding its way back to you by sunset. Drop a comment and let me know. Has anyone in your family ever laughed off something that genuinely mattered to you? I'd love to hear your story too. If you enjoyed this one, subscribe, ring that little bell, and I'll see you in the next story, dear.